sake of time. Thank you so much. So one of the things I also built in as well is, we've talked about not just the reviewer, right? Not just the associate editor, but also managing editor. So as a reminder, and I'm doing this because we've done this fellowship in the past and people continue to get confused about what role is what. Managing editor, right? They're the first person who puts eyes on the manuscript. They confirm the guidelines, right? So you can see things here in red. Does the paper actually have the name, the abstract, the introduction? Now, obviously, all the guidelines are different depending on what type of paper it is. So I will say that this lecture is focused on those papers that are very traditional and do have the introduction, the discussion, the results, etc. Right? So managing editor, confirming guidelines one, checking quickly for plagiarism. We don't use a tool here at BCPHR. There are lots of different tools on the market for that. And some journals do use them and do swear by them. We just go by an honor system. And then obviously the managing editor can scan for AI use as well. That's also professional judgment. If the managing editor says, you know what, there are a number of things that haven't been followed in terms of the guidelines, and I strongly suggest feel plagiarism or AI use, they can desk reject, i.e., just send that message. Sorry, it's no longer being considered, and we usually tell people exactly why we think that is, right? XYZ guidelines haven't been made, or we have a strong feeling of plagiarism or AI use. The managing editor could potentially reach out to the author at this stage, but usually it's probably better to just go ahead and desk reject. When we start to have conversations about things and ask authors about, well, did you do this or did you do that? It's usually when it's moved a little bit further along in the peer review process. So guidelines. So as you guys may know, we have this up on our website. And so obviously it's like the template that people have to be able to use. All journals have that. Why? Because it's easier to read for all the reviewers, and two, it's easier to be able to publish. It becomes absolute insanity when people are turning things in and they're formatted all different kinds of ways. So that's the reason why people do it, not because journals are trying to be unnecessarily strict, because any process where you have to send it back to the author and have things changed, all of that is timely and all of that is costly. So hence why, journals have the guidelines, right? And so that has everything from exactly where things should be, where the introduction is, where the methodology, etc. Fonts, pages, language, positionality statement, figures, tables, and images. We have lots of different guidelines around how those should actually be formatted as well. And so, as I'm saying, if you are the managing editor, you have to be able to check all of those things, right? Because if, as the managing editor, you push something forward and it's not fitting those guidelines, that becomes costly for the journal. Because, say, it goes through peer review and then it's something that that author has to redo at some later point. Okay. So these are all the different types of articles that BCPHR accepts. This lecture is focused on original research articles, so what you typically think of in terms of an academic paper. But we do accept other things, anywhere from the op-eds, blogs, review articles, research letters, posters, etc. And so obviously there are different guidelines for all of those, and obviously slightly different ways that you might actually go about writing a review for those particular types of articles. But for the sake of today, we'll talk about this. If people are interested in how you might write a review for any of the others, you can set up a office hour meeting with myself or Dr. LeCompte or Catherine, if Catherine, you're having any office hours, to see how would the review differ for any of those. So remember, reminder, right? Associate editor, you're reading, you're checking for a fit, and then you're determining, do I move this along to peer review or not? So just quick rhetorical question, because we won't have a chance to discuss it. Could groundbreaking research even thrive without the true expertise and scrutiny of dedicated reviewers? And so I'll pause and say likely not, right? So the peer review process has been going on for a very long time. So ultimately, it is the way that we trust that what's being done is in fact put through a very intellectually rigorous process. All right, so getting to the meat and potatoes, right? Reviewer. So if you're acting as a reviewer, you're reading your manuscript, you're assessing every aspect of it, and then for part of our journal, we actually allow people to make reviewers to make a recommendation. Would I accept, would I reject, or would I recommend revise and resubmit? And I'll just say a subtle point, the reviewer can make a recommendation, but ultimately it's the associate editor and the editors in chief that then decide, do I want to accept this or do I want to reject this or revise it? So not all journals are the same way. Some journals don't allow reviewers to even make recommendations. So just kind of a subtle point there, that we do allow that, because we do trust, in fact, most of our reviewers' opinion, and we do a lot more vetting. But there are some journals that don't do that at all. They just look at the review and then they make a determination. Well, I think that this reviewer would probably reject, et cetera, et cetera. All right, so you've seen this slide before, right? What makes an excellent review? Timeliness is number one again, right? The reason why so many journals can take 6 months to a year is because of how well things are coordinated, how well their editors are actually getting something into the peer review process, how well the reviewers are actually doing the reviews, et cetera, and moving through all that. So being timely is absolutely paramount. For those of you who have been authors, the worst thing, right, is agonizing over how long it's going to take for something to get published, and there's all this lost time potentially of you being able to submit that to another journal. So with BCPHR, we try to make that promise that if we say we're going to be able to publish something, within a month's time, and letting you know that it's going to be accepted or not within 2 weeks, that we make true on that promise, right? And then as you guys saw with the number of the different reviews, you want it to be clear, and obviously constructive and realistic in terms of what the author or authors can do going forward, and then comprehensive. So obviously you saw a number of different reviews. Some was, the one was very exhaustive, and the others were decently comprehensive, right? Like they don't have to list every single thing. That's great. But they definitely hone in on the things that are like, what are the things that are really going to move the needle with this paper? All right. So you as the reviewer, right, you have to critically evaluate every aspect of the journal, its validity, its significance, right, the methodology, having integrity in terms of identifying any biases, ethical concerns that the paper may raise or the particular authors on that particular research project. And then obviously, like, with each journal is different. There's some journals that they only want the most original manuscripts. With BCPHR, we're a little more open to things not having to be the most cutting edge. So that's another subtle point as well, that when you're reading a paper and you're trying to decide, well, I've actually seen this written before, understand that BCPHR is open to that, as opposed to some journals where they would not publish anything that is not the absolute most groundbreaking. So obviously that's going to depend journal to journal. All right. So understanding, I'll just move forward here. So the biggest thing, right, in the review process is when you're looking at this, and we'll go through every single thing in turn, right, is when someone's writing their research, do they position their research in the landscape of other research that's relevant, right? I've seen even most recently a paper that like just kind of made it seem as if their research dropped out of like the middle of nowhere, but they didn't describe like what's come before them or what is happening currently. So that's one of the biggest things to be able to notice when you're when you're giving feedback on a particular manuscript. Obviously, the strengths of not everything from the methodology, but also their discussion of their arguments, their conclusions, right, of their methodology, limitations. So I've seen plenty of papers where like they say, oh, there was one limitation of this research, and as a reviewer, you can snip that out and say, absolutely not. There are more limitations than that, and push the authors to mention, realistically, what are some of the limitations of the research that they're doing or the conclusions that they're making. And then ultimately, even the best thing, I think Catherine mentioned this the last time as well, like authors can't just, have a great paper, right? Great research and great conclusions. So what is the point of this? What's your call to action? Are you and your authors doing more research? Are you encouraging more research? Are you hoping for there to be a change in policy and a change in practice? I think that's one of the biggest things that we definitely want to make sure that we see, right? So you've got a high bar, right, as a reviewer, all these different things that you're looking for, and then you're commenting on in a paper. So we'll go into reasons to recuse yourself from a review. I was going to make this a group activity, but for the sake of time, we won't. So I'll say this briefly, right? You have to, as the editors in chief, we're not going to tell you whether or not you should recuse yourself from a paper. So it's up to each and all of you to decide, should I take this paper? One of the more easy ways to decide is, does this fit into your area of expertise? Now, granted, we're more open to, obviously, some of you are much younger in your career, right? And so you may say, it's all over my head. So it's a matter of like, to what extent is it over your head? If the methodology is incredibly complex, you've never heard of it before, would probably be something that I'm going to recuse myself from this. I'm not even going to say yes to it. But each person has to decide for themselves, should I recuse myself? Simple reason, it's over my head for whatever reason, or there are a number of other things, right? You personally know the author. You might have collaborated with them. Maybe you're in the same institution. This may or may not be relevant, right? Say there's certain financial stakes involved to that, other competitive conflicts, or hopefully not, but you might be strongly opposed, to the exact kind of research that they're doing. So instead of writing a scathing review and being very biased, you can just recuse yourself from it. So very important as a reviewer. The best reviews are those that are unbiased and unrelated, or excuse me, and devoid of any conflicts of interest, right? The worst thing is when you have reviews like that, and as these associate editors, right, you're trusting that they would have recused themselves from something that they would have a conflict of interest with. All right. So initial assessment, right? So going even deeper. So you download your manuscript, from Scholastica to be able to read it, and then you're looking to see scope and relevance. Granted, the associate editor has already done that, but just in case the associate editor has missed anything, you're looking to see, is this about like, diabetes in dogs? Is this about something that is very heavily weighted legally? And like I said, we have gotten articles like this before, and there might be maybe two sentences that are public health relevant. Then you have to decide, when you're writing your review, do you say, this is what I recommend you do to be able to bring out the different aspects of public health, health equity, or health justice in your paper? Because right now it leans more towards a legal audience or whatever the case may be. And sometimes the reason that happens is because you might have someone who is in the legal arena and they're like, let me throw this at a public health journal and see if it gets accepted. And that's why you'll see that because it initially was not written for a public health journal. But as I said, if there's an angle that you could find, then definitely as a reviewer, make sure that you mention that. Obviously, looking to see the overall sense of rigor, right? Your initial assessment. We will have further discussions about this later. Typically, you want to read a manuscript more than once. So you don't want to blow through it super fast and then say, okay, methodology, results, et cetera, et cetera. You usually want to do your initial read, not taking any notes or anything, get a sense of like the lay of the land, what exactly is there, tables and figures, et cetera, overall. And then depending on where you go from that, some people can do multiple rereads. You might do a second reread where you're like, now I'm just focusing on X, Y, etc. And so, especially depending on how much the research is purporting, the conclusions, the seriousness of the conclusions, etc., may require you to read it a few more times to really trust that you get a very substantive review. However, if it's like an op-ed, you may feel comfortable just reading it that first time, and then the second time when you go through it, then you're making like your notations on the different parts about it. So evaluating the abstract, right? So as I said before, right, you go like head to toe for the manuscript, looking at the abstract, right? So we don't want abstracts that are too long, right? You want it to be clear and brief enough to get a good summary of the paper. Hence why you read it more than once, because you can, if you read it one time, it's easy to say, oh, the abstract looks good. But if you read it a few times, you can say, wait a second, the abstract has actually left certain things out that would be key to be able to for it to be put there, especially when we know most people, when they're looking in PubMed at papers, they're reading the abstract first. So if a paper is doing itself a disservice and not mentioning certain things, then people will not have a full understanding of that. So that's one of the things you can do as a reviewer. Does the abstract have that perfect balance of like concisely showing what the paper is about, but at the same time not doing itself a disservice by leaning too strongly in one direction or another? Introduction. So I mentioned this before, right? Um, does the introduction, and this is a very easy one to spot with many manuscripts, and does it just have a couple statistics that seem kind of compelling and then immediately go into the next thing? Or, as I said before, does it ground itself in what came before it, what is currently happening right now in the research landscape? And then what's the importance of this paper in the first place, right? Not just like, oh yeah, we have a couple statistics and ergo, that's why we should do another paper. And we definitely get a lot of papers like that as well. So research landscape. And then also, what's the objective of the paper, right? This is always easy to spot as well. Is it well articulated? Did they think very deeply about that? And has it been displayed? So you know, well, why did they even waste their time in writing and doing the research and writing this paper in the first place? For methodology, right, making sure that they describe exactly what the methodology was about and whether or not it can be replicated. So this is also a balancing act as well. You don't have to be so exhaustive, but just enough so that people understand what is exactly happening, right? And is it described in such a way that it's described in other types of papers? So if you are obviously you're comfortable with the methodology, but still somewhat uncertain, it is okay to see other papers that have been published in the field that have a similar methodology. And if you want to look at them and say, okay, how is this other methodology written about to help you inform your review for another paper that has a identical or a similar methodology. So same thing as well, like some of the things I see most often is that they'll drop a lot of different sampling techniques or data sources, but they may not briefly describe what these things are. So easy way to catch an author out is to say, describe exactly where this data source came from, exactly what these different things mean, because sometimes it's just kind of like a whole block of jargon. And ultimately, we are a journal that wants to be more accessible. So even though obviously you might still have to have a certain level of understanding of certain things, the authors still have to explain them just enough so that someone can be able to understand them.
Dr. Carpenter, not to pause your flow, but to your
Sure.
last bullet point on this slide, you say, are the limitations being acknowledged? Traditionally, there is a limitation section in a original research article, but does BCPHR also expect authors to have that limitation noted in their methods section as it applies to the methods?
Yeah, absolutely. So, BCPHR, we don't have a hard and fast rule that limitations of the methodology itself has to be there. So, nice point there. I know there are some journals that like explicitly they name the limitations right there. But no, we don't have that. Like as long as the limitation is mentioned somewhere, but it doesn't have to be here. But yes, good point that some journals definitely have it explicitly, as in obviously it's like, why did we choose this one as opposed to other ones? That people might think are more suitable, right? And so sometimes authors will list it exactly there because it's very appropriate. Mhm. All right. So when looking at the results, I think many of you have said this before as well, right? So there will be papers that you see where it's great introductions, great landscapes, the methodology is like top notch. Then you get to the results and you're like, you are really making a leap here in terms of what exactly you think is coming from here. So making sure like, do the results exactly fit? From that particular type of research, and are they accurate and valid? Now, sometimes this can get a little tricky, hence why it's important, before you officially accept a paper to glance through it. And if you don't feel comfortable being able to say, I think that these results are solid versus not, obviously that determines whether or not you take the paper on. And then ultimately, yeah, like are they describing results in a sufficient detail? Because there can be many papers where they focus on only some results, and then they may have a table or a figure that describes some of the other results, but for whatever reason, it's not in the text, and so that's important to bring up. Sometimes the authors come back and they say, well, I there was a word limit, so I didn't list all of the results in the text. But other times, it's actually a sneaky way to just not really highlight results that they may find unflattering or don't necessarily fit the conclusions that they're trying to make. So easy thing to be on the lookout for. Another thing that we think is great as well is authors have an opportunity to be able to make their papers even more accessible with a number of different graphs and charts and tables and infographics. So if you see a paper and it has no visual media or if it has limited visual media, definitely as a reviewer, mention that as well because that really helps to make the paper accessible and even more interesting as well. So I definitely know I've seen many strong papers, and like they didn't, make any effort, to be able to add some visual media to it. So definitely, as any of your recommendations, you may say, I recommend, and you could be very explicit, right? You have a very detailed methodology. Perhaps you want to do an infographic to be able to explain that to the audience, right? Or I think this might be this results are well displayed in a scatter plot or a histogram, etc., right? You can make those recommendations. Whether or not the author actually does it is a different story. All right. So evaluating the discussion. So also, like, is it a clear interpretation of the results, or similarly, are we leaping, from um, uh, a preconceived conclusion, which sometimes you get a feeling of that with certain papers? Or in fact, is their discussion grounding, a reasonable interpretation of their results? And then another thing that many authors I see will miss as well is like, so how do their findings fit in the existing literature? So just as like the introduction sets the stage of why the research was done in the first place amongst all the other literature that exists, the discussion is important to also say, so what do your findings say, right? Do they align with what's already been done? Do they contradict it, et cetera? Like, I think that's a huge thing to ultimately be able, to say, so what are the implications, right? If you have something that contradicts previous literature, that absolutely needs to be discussed. Obviously, if it aligns very much so, then what is the importance of that alignment? And then ultimately, what are the implications? What do you want people to be able to do? So authors may easily say, oh, we're just going to do more research, but don't allow authors to miss that opportunity to say what other people should be doing, right? The reason of writing a paper is just not to say we did this, but it's also to have that call to action of what can be done by other people, especially within public health. Oops. So assessing the references. So just like any other part of the paper, assessing the references is important. I'll say that when I'm actually acting as a reviewer, I actually look at the references first, because one, I want to make sure that they are in fact reputable, that there's a variety of sources, and that they're a substantive number of sources as well. So I tend to get suspicious of any paper that only has 10 or less references. That might be my particular bias, but even with op-eds, I'm like, ooh, I'm getting very allergic. I'm like, you have 5 references. How are you making any conclusions about anything? So looking at the references and saying, here's the other trick. So um, the way that papers gain more traction is the more your references mention reputable journals, the better it is in terms of indexing. So just kind of even as you write your own papers as well, right? So it's one thing to just whatever like references I find for my paper, as opposed to like, let me be strategic. I want my references to be those that are being well cited in the field as well, because everything ends up essentially synergizing with something else. And then ultimately, right, obviously, like as you're looking through the paper, the in-text citations, people do miss opportunities where they're making claims and they haven't done that. And so you can help them and say, I know you didn't mean to plagiarize. Make sure that you cite this because you're making a lot of claims, but you're not citing it in the text. All right, so we've gone through this before. So as all of you decide how you want to write your reviews, you may decide to create templates of your own. So even though we do have a form in BCPHR to fill out, you may still decide, I want a number of templates so all of my reviews read the same. Especially if you're doing a lot of reviews, then you easily may want to just plug and play. So I have a few things here for, you if you want to be able to say, I'm always going to say something about the introduction, the methodology, the results of the discussion, etc. So, think about, do I want to make templates for those so I can easily plug and play? Because it does start getting a bit exhaustive when you're doing it all by hand. And then I had a few additional points in terms of, things that most people think about when they're reviewing a paper, right? Grammar. As we've talked about, your biggest job is not looking at the grammar. However, do not neglect it. Don't assume the managing editor's job is not looking at grammar. So they didn't do it, and neither did the associate editor. And things still make it through to publication, ironically. So as a reviewer, don't have your first focus be on grammar and style. But definitely if you catch something, for sure, make sure you mention it and even have like your own section on that as well. And so I mentioned a few things just because I'm a bit of a stickler. I know a lot of research tends to be written in passive voice, but ultimately I think it's more digestible by larger audiences if you have a good balance of active and passive voice, right? So I just had a couple different examples of that. Overly long sentences, public health definitely is guilty of that. So if you see certain sentences that are too long or definitely confusing, call it out. Absolutely. You can go as far as to actually recommend this is how it could be reworded if you want to do that, but you don't have to. You can just say these sentences are confusing. I strongly recommend rewording them, for ease of reading. And then hedging, this is one of my favorite ones. So understandably, when you're uncertain about your conclusions, you may hedge and use things like may, could, appears. But then it's just a matter of like, does the author mean to hedge or are they just actually writing inappropriately? So you can have an eye for that as well. If you think they should say something more confidently and definitively, feel free to say that. Versus if they're saying something too confidently, but you don't think that actually they should be saying it that confidently. So just some subtle aspects to the grammar and style. So again, right, what makes an excellent review? So every single one of you, right, I'm going to get nothing but excellent reviews from all of you. We know exactly what an excellent review looks like. So you're not going to be that person who's like, doesn't matter, I'm like a tenured professor. I can say yes, no, sounds good, and that's call it a review, right? All right, so I'm just looking at time. I know we're a bit over, so I'll probably stop there. We'll be able to send this out. So the only thing was it was just going into greater depth about the actual rubric that BCPHR uses. So I think we can, Cersei, if you give me a little bit of time from your lecture next week, then I'll briefly go over that and that'll get us up to speed. But any questions, comments?
Yes, sorry. I had two questions. W- One, because you mentioned this earlier about originality
Mhm.
BCPHR not really looking for the most cutting edge. I was really curious about what BCPHR's approach to originality is and how you evaluate that. And then the second question I had was about target audiences. I'm sure this is probably implied, but um, I'm curious to know what BCPHR's target audiences are. I assume that might be different based on the different types of articles that we have, and I think that will also impact the like how you phrase the call to action and what type of verbiage you use, things like that. So yeah, just curious about how BCPHR approaches both of these things.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are great questions. And like now we're getting to like finer subtleties of it. So and Cersei, I'd love you to jump in on this one. We definitely have had many long conversations on how do we determine originality, because there have been some papers where, for me at least, my gut instinct is this is not original at all. So I typically would say, especially when we were in the COVID era, and it's like there have been 1,000 papers that have been written like that. And so I think the biggest thing for me is like the number of other papers that exist on the same topic and like whether or not the paper is taking any kind of different angle to it. But if it really does seem like it is a complete regurgitation of something that exists like 100-fold, then yes, like it's not original enough. And even if it's well written, it will get rejected for that reason. That's not the best metric, right? Like to say like, oh, like I know it's been written about, etc. But yeah, I would say like if there's literally like 500 papers just like this. There's no new angle at all. Reject. And like I said, New England Journal of Medicine might say like we only want something that we may know that there are only 10 other papers out there, right, that have been written about this topic or with this particular angle. So that's the first part. Anything you wanted to add to that, Cersei, in terms of determining whether or not originality is strong enough to accept versus reject? You're muted.
Yes, I didn't want folks to hear a cat meowing. Thank you. So I appreciate the opportunity to share. I was because I answered a few questions in the chat while you were
Mhm.
talking.
Thank you.
And I think like really it goes back to our mission and vision. So our audience really are those or anyone who's addressing issues of like public health through the lenses of justice and equity. And originality really starts with ensuring that the the article, the manuscript itself, I should say, is doing the same. So someone who might submit an article about, the public health implications of cancer research, like tons of those types of articles are out there that probably won't make it through, probably would even get dust rejected. To be original, perhaps it's looking at, specific social determinants driving cancer in or cancer rates in a specific marginalized group. So perhaps looking at gentrification's impact, the built environment, and then, from there, an associate editor might do a literature search, making sure that this isn't replicating something that's already been done. Perhaps these authors are talking about a specific intervention that they did. Again, looking to make sure that no one else has published on it. And then looking at the citations, making sure that they've cited the seminal work, but also those pieces that have been published recently. That really sets the stage for it being something that's contributing to the literature rather than repeating or borrowing or regurgitating something. And that kind of speaks obviously to what Dr. Carpenter was saying, but I always think of it from our mission, our directive for our existence, and that kind of informs every other aspect. But I want to hand it back to you, Dr.
Yeah.
Carpenter.
No, I'll just iterate it. So I called it angles, but I think you literally enumerated it a little bit better, right? So is it dealing with a different type of population or different subgroup? So that's a different angle. Is it doing an intervention whereas other types of research hasn't? And then I think Dr. Lecomte gave basically like a easy way to cheat, right? Look at some of the work that they've cited. If they seem like a complete regurgitation of the work they've cited, then there's your answer. They're regurgitating. Versus if you're like, wait, they've cited this other thing and we actually know how they're growing from it, like what they've changed about it, then that helps you as well. But that's just kind of a professional judgment. We haven't officially put that into to anything. And then I think Dr. Lecomte, you mentioned the target audience as well. We can actually speak to that because we track the audience quite well. I think we're strongest obviously here in the US, the UK, and I think India, or is it just general Southeast Asia, that BCPHR has a foothold. And we have everything from, high school students, up to people, who are tenured professors looking at our work. We actually had people email us. I know we had someone who graduated from college and then she wrote to us and she said, I wouldn't have gotten through my public health degree if it weren't for BCPHR. So she was using many of our open access papers to be able to write her papers. So we were very proud of that.
Yeah. And we've also published, we've published folks like Paul Farmer, if you've heard of his work, as well as Nancy Krieger, and then some exceptional high school students, as Dr. Carpenter said. So we have a pretty large gambit.
Mhm. But I am sensitive to time. If you have any other
Yeah.
questions, I'm very happy for you to send them exactly to me. So next week we'll have Dr. Lecomte's lecture. I'll finish up with a little bit extra things. And Sabath, I'll invite you because I know you had a few things to say.
Yeah, just wanted to